Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Sean Maloney is my guest in this episode. Sean is a professor in the History Department of the Royal Military College of Canada here in Kingston, Ontario. One of his primary areas of interest is the Cold War. He also has a focus on the use of nuclear weapons. Sean joins me to discuss Vladimir Putin, his control over Russia, and the motivation behind his ruthless invasion of Ukraine. Sean sheds some light on the history of the current ruling group in Russia and their control of the media, and how these factors have contributed to Putin's power. This is an episode I think you'll find very interesting. Here is my conversation with Professor Sean Maloney. Sean, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks very much.
I appreciate you giving us some of your time today. And before we start, we'd like to remind those of you who are listening to this podcast that we are recording it in early March of 2023. So let's begin by talking about your role as a historian within the military. When you do a lot of traveling, and you have done a lot of traveling, what sorts of things do you do in those hotspots as a historian?
Well, I first started doing this when we drew down from NATO at the end of the Cold War. I was the historian for our army forces that were deployed in Germany. And so when the wall went down, I was in Germany writing the history of what we did there for the previous 42 years. And that allowed me insight into all sorts of things, particularly planning and what we thought we were going to do, everything. I had basically had access to everything, so I could look back at the whole period. And at that point, the Balkans collapsed, specifically Yugoslavia. So the last chapter of that particular history was the first deployment to Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia. So I got interested in that. And at that particular point in time, I started a PhD, which eventually became a history of Canada's involvement with nuclear weapons in the Cold War. So my interest in the Cold War and nuclear weapons goes right back to that period. But later on, I was asked to be the historian for the war in Afghanistan. Now, I'd been interested in that right from the get-go from 9/11. And I made an initial trip over there in 2003 to take a look, see what was going on. And I continued to go back. So I built up a rapport with elements of the power structure in Kandahar. And eventually I was asked to do the job for us to keep track of everything on the ground there and then write the history for it. So that lasted for quite some time until the end game in 2011. And then I did a lot of writing on the history. And then when that was over, I shifted back to the Cold War. So around 2014. And a lot had been declassified, a lot of new literature on the Soviet Union had come out. Everything had changed in terms of how we understood the Cold War. And so I focused on that. And then Ukraine started. Now, I was working on a book on Soviet nuclear weapons in Ukraine right before the latest phase of the invasion. So I was over there in 2019 doing research. Got to know a lot of people in Ukraine, drove all over Ukraine except to occupy Crimea. And so everything kind of dovetailed into this with the latest phase of hostilities.
Now, you are there as a civilian or in the military?
As a civilian.
Okay. So that's what you've done all along, is work as a civilian with the military.
Well, I'm a history prof at RMC.
Right.
And so
right.
As an academic, we basically focus on whatever we're interested in. And those are the things I was interested in. So
yeah. And apparently there haven't been too many historians working with the Canadian military in the hotspot since what, World War II?
Pretty much, from what I can tell, yeah.
Okay.
There have been people that did deploy to Kandahar airfield, but in my role, I went out on operations. I'd watch operations be planned. I'd go out on them, and then watch the after-action report, that sort of thing. I wound up on numerous operations in Afghanistan at all levels.
Now, in the episode today, we're going to focus on one particular side. I know that there are two sides to every conflict, but given the length of this particular war, I thought I would focus on Putin, Russia, and why he is seeking to continue the madness that he is undertaking right now. Let's start with that why. Most of the media right now is suggesting that he is doing this, invading Ukraine and fighting in Ukraine to reassert control over how he considers Ukraine to be a historical part of Russia. Is that an oversimplification?
That's actually not really. It's actually one part of a larger landscape or portrait. It goes right back to the early 1990s. And there were a cluster of people working in St. Petersburg, almost all of them ex-KGB. And from what I can tell, basic Putin was one of them, became the leader of them. We called them the Siloviki. And there's a number of things that motivate them. One, initially, is revenge. They view the USSR as being deliberately collapsed by very sophisticated information operations conducted in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
So the first motive is revenge. The second is nostalgia for what they see as a better time. It was better for them, but not for people locked up in gulags. So they have a nostalgic view of the Soviet Union. At the same time, they realized throughout the 1990s there was money to be made in the collapse of the USSR and its fragmentation and its reorientation. So they exploited that. Throughout this period in parallel, and this is really important, there's a whole burst of literature in Russian that seeks to locate where Russia should be in the world stage, on the world stage. And it's very strange. I've read through this stuff, and it seems crazy to us, but it's not crazy to them. And a lot of it is actually, I refer to it in some of my lectures as Mein Kampf and Cyrillic. The people that are writing about these things, they come across as Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theorists. There are people that are trying to understand the collapse of the Soviet Union as an aggressive action by the West. And then there's a concept called Eurasianism. And when you read this stuff, like, again, we don't really see it in English. Nobody really talks about it here except for a handful of specialists. Under Eurasianism, they have this idea of a Russian-dominated space from Vladivostok to Vancouver. Okay? And
Okay.
they have a very strange view of the world that would not stand up to academic scrutiny here, but it's enabled by academics there. And then also in the mix, to make it even more complicated, is the Russian Orthodox Church and how it comes back onto the scene in the 1990s. And it's highly nationalistic. It has concepts of Russian destiny, Ruski Mir, i.e. Russian peace. And when you put that suit together and you boil it, that's when you get Putin coming to the fore around 2000. And then from there, it's once he's in charge, the Siloviki are in all the positions of control. You can track all of this from 2000 right up to today. So there's a trajectory right there of what they want, how they're going to go about doing it. And the first thing they did pretty much was rebuild their strategic nuclear forces. Okay? They view that as the centerpiece for what they're doing. If they have that, then they can do whatever they want because we're deterred. So that the nuclear part of it is integral to this. So it's not as simple as reconstructing the Soviet Union, and it's not as simple as reconstructing the Russian Empire. It's something else. It's a merger of the two with this concept of destiny, where they're destined to rule Europe, and Ukraine is in the way because Ukraine won't play that game. Neither will the Baltic countries. So then you have a subset of this that attacks Ukraine as being full of neo-Nazis. There's this very strange to us, but not to them, idea that LGBTQ people are a vector for biological warfare to destroy the Russian body politic. That's aided and abetted by the Russian Orthodox Church, and it's in fact built into their ideology. We don't see any of this. Like, Canadian journalists don't cover this.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's not transmitted to the Canadian public. They only see what's happened in the past year or two because we have short attention span theater in this country, and nobody wants to really look at complex causation. So then so we're subjected to their information operations trying to skew our perception of what they're doing. And that's what gets fed into the Canadian discussion about this. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm curious to know if you want to go into a bit more detail on who is it that is promoting this particular scenario with the destiny aspect of where Russia or the Soviet Union should be. Can
There's
you
a
identify who it is? Like it's a
there's a collection of things like Putin and his people fall back on a Russian fascist named Ivan Ilyin, who was writing as an emigre or exile in the 1920s and 30s, and he dies in the 50s. And they throw him out front as the main ideological pillar, but there are others. There's a guy named Alexander Dugin, who really pushes. He's an omnivore when it comes to philosophy, but he really pushes Eurasianism. There's a guy named Lev Gamiliev who does the same thing and just in a different shade. And you can see how the people that surround Putin are influenced by them. There's a guy named Patrushev, who's in charge of the Security Council, and he's definitely influenced by all the people we've talked about. And there are others as well. I've actually been working on this lately. And in their speeches, in their public utterances, in the language used within the Russian bureaucracy, it all comes back to this cluster of ideas and people we've been talking about in the 1990s. But the pillar of it is Ivan Ilyin, from what I can see. And when you're looking at, I'm not kidding. It's like you're reading Mein Kampf and Srellik.
yeah.
Okay. I mean, the idea that there's a Jewish conspiracy behind all of this it's talked about internally, but not necessarily expressed as part of their official policy. But then they let it out through their like Russian media is not Russian media. Like we have media. They're outlets for information and ideas they want to push, and you can see it in there, so they can keep it deniable in polite diplomatic circles, for example.
Now you talk about their Jewish conspiracy theories that they have right now, but they're also at the same time talking about the neo-Nazis that are in the Ukraine. Where does that neo-Nazism in the Ukraine come from, that concept?
That's interesting. That only seems to pop up around 2014. Okay. And so
when they invade Crimea?
Well, yeah, when they go into Crimea, and they actually plan to take Ukraine was much broader than what they got in 2014. But then we have to come back to the concept of the color revolution. And this underpins pretty much everything. And it's linked to the other issues we've got. So in the early 2000s, there's two demonstrations that wind up changing governments, one in Georgia and one in Ukraine. And these are independent events. These are collections of people that have had enough of the corruption, and they force changes within the government non-violently. So the fear inside Russia is that they know they're corrupt, and they've got a population that is susceptible to these ideas, that there might be a so-called color revolution in Russia. And what happens is they just label these things as if they're a singular event that are being manipulated from the outside. And they're being manipulated from the outside by Zionist, neo-Nazi, LGBTQ forces aided and abetted by the United States and the CIA. Okay? So there's conspiracism that underpins all of this. So the academics in Russia create theory without facts to bolster the ideology. And so you see this proliferation of literature and color revolutions. So anything that's anti-Moscow in the post-Soviet space is deemed a color revolution. And when they want to stop that or interfere with it, like Georgia or Belarus or in Ukraine, they'll look for local things they can latch onto. The other thing that's underpinning all of this is this nostalgia for the Second World War, which they call the Great Patriotic War, which isn't new. It starts really in the 70s, but it becomes operationalized by the 2000s. So if you're going to go into Ukraine, one of the best ways to do it is to portray it as an extension of or descendant of Nazi Germany, so that to motivate people and to provide ideological and legitimate top cover for it. So they're going to look for small groups of people, and we have them here as well, who push neo-Nazi ideas. They're going to escalate and elevate and magnify their importance in the environments that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But you really won't see that in they'll start using it as a propaganda thing around 2014, and then it accelerates from there. So you'll see a lot, and of course, a lot of Canadian media falls for it because it's simplistic, The history of Eastern Europe is incredibly complex. We don't teach it here at all. And you've got a very complex situation that developed during the Second World War. And Timothy Snyder covers this very well in Bloodlands and his other writings, where you've got people that are caught between two totalitarian ideologies, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And they're going to people that are going to side with each, right? Because survivable or whatever. And then you've got a whole bunch of Ukrainian nationalists that are trying to recreate an independent Ukraine, which had existed in 1919. So it's very easy to cherry pick at that and, quote, prove that there's some kind of neo-Nazi ideology in Ukraine or organization or people that are trying to stop the destiny of Russia as it marches west. Got it?
Yep.
And so it's very easy to pick particular people who display particular symbols and then say that this handful of people or small group of people reflects the beliefs of 44 million people. And Canadian media fell for that regularly. I don't think it does as much anymore.
Yeah.
But they never bothered. We're back to taking the time to examine what happened historically, to examine the evolution of people and ideas and groups.
Let's go back a little bit. I can remember growing up, the news coverage of the so-called Cold War is what they called it at the time. So if we go back, let's say, to Khrushchev and Kennedy, to the 60s,
Yep.
and look at what we see in the news about how Russian governments, or in that time, Soviet governments, evolved in terms of the control that they had in replacing one leader after another. And does the Cold War play into what you have just described as the current philosophies?
I would say ideologically, no. We're not dealing with a new Soviet-dominated communist ideology. In fact, what's really interesting is to watch how our opponents fund both sides in the West, extreme left and extreme right, to generate what they call, it translates to contradictions. Because if you generate contradictions, you basically jam a society.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they've been doing. They started doing this in Western Europe, and there's significant scholarship on this starting around 2005. And so they'll fund, support anything that sort of will be disruptive or will generate problems in societies. The anti-immigration issue in Europe is one of those. It's not like they control it, but they'll aggravate that. Same thing happens here with the sort of the trucker convoy stuff. They didn't control it, but they aggravated it and they used it for their own information operations.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, when we're dealing with Cold War type ideologies, no. And in fact, if we actually sat down with a guy like Patrushev or something like that and asked him what he really believed versus what he says, I'm not exactly sure what he'd say. It's like, did bin Laden believe his own bullshit about taking over the world with a jihad? Or was this a power trip for him? Yeah. Did Hitler believe in his ideology? Did Stalin believe in it? We're never going to know that for sure with these personalities. We can only work with the convergence of evidence of how they behave, what they say, what their closest family and friends say. They say what they think they say, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But in my sense, from the work that I've done on Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, all the other stuff, other leaders here, fundamentally, it's about power, like any politician. Our politicians are no different in that regard. That there are people that want power, and they will gravitate to systems that give it to them. So there's a psychological dimension of this as well.
Does the system that exists today in Russia in terms of the leadership, so if we talk about Putin and his control over Russia, is that the same sort of power that people back in the days of Khrushchev and Brezhnev had, or was there more of a collective that controlled the leader at the top?
Well, in this case here, it's far more sophisticated because of our information technologies, the education systems, the need, in their sense, to discredit ideas that might interfere with what they're doing. The role of religion in Russia now versus the role of religion in 1930. Okay, so in this case, we're dealing with something that's completely different. in my view.
Mm-hmm.
It still has its historical basis, and it has its own history behind that and its own mythology around that. But what we're dealing with is something that's different. We're dealing with we are dealing with a fascist state that uses modern technology to manipulate its population, uses religion to manipulate its population, uses education to manipulate its population based on all that ideological stuff I talked about. I saw footage of a group of children in uniform singing a song about taking back Alaska the other day. Okay.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There's tons of it. Like, if you go in and look at it, it's there. You can see it. Again, you have to take the time to do it. And again, we don't have a lot of people that do that here. And again, people aren't going to read a 400-page book if they're trying to pay the bills, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And not everybody is a scholar in Canada, nor should they be. But this is what I see.
Yeah. How would you rate their use of technology versus the West?
In terms of information technology and the ability to manipulate a population, they're very good at that. They actually have a term, it translates in English as political technologies. That's the term they use.
Yeah.
What it is, it's really processes and understanding things in psychology, as well as the actual physical technology like the one we're using right now.
Mm-hmm.
They understand that very well. And they understood us really well up until about last year, when all of a sudden none of this worked. So they keep trying, and they keep generating confusion and problems, especially in the U.S. But all of a sudden, they've been shown to be what they are. The massacres at Bucha and the revelations of the atrocities elsewhere, they can try to hide that from their people or justify it, and they can even get their own people to believe that it's acceptable. But for the rest of us, who haven't seen this stuff since the Balkans, let alone the Second World War, this is who they are. This is what they're about.
Yeah. Can they hide it from their people in the long term?
Well, there's a number of us to talk about that, and we've come to the conclusion that the Russian people as a whole don't care. Like they've bought into this expansionist idea. They don't think the way we do. We like to think that everybody's the same and thinks the same way. Yeah. They don't at all. So again, it's not necessarily rigid control, but they influence so many levels of society. And they've been working on the next generation, or this generation, for the past 20 years, without us paying any attention to it.
Yeah.
So
Russia still has a large military. Their economy is reasonably strong up until the sanctions that were imposed. And I'm curious to know if you have any sense as to whether or not these sanctions from the West are having an impact in Russia.
Yeah, it's a constant erosion in certain key areas and technologies, and the restriction of their ability to make hard currency from oil, gas, other petroleum products, etc. That's been reduced. You can't do. One thing we've known historically is that sanctions don't work on their own.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be part of a larger strategy with other facets to it, right?
Yeah.
For example, Saddam Hussein, there were sanctions on the Hussein regime. He just kept building bigger palaces, right? And then ultimately, it reached the point where he had to go. In this case, you've got, it'll continue, their economy will continue to chug along in Russia. There's no doubt about it. They're going to look for avenues to try and improve it. But what it does is it generates tremendous amounts of friction within their ability to do what they want and get what they want. But you can't just do sanctions and say that's the end of it. We've contained them. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
They work in conjunction with nuclear deterrence, with heavy diplomacy, with signaling exercises and demonstrations of strength by our side.
One of the things I'm interested in is to know what role China plays in all of this. Given that we're recording this a few days after the new foreign minister of China made a rather aggressive statements or series of statements at a press conference. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of that at this point.
Well, my focus has mostly been on the situation in Europe, and obviously keeping track of what's going on vis-a-vis Chinese influence activities in Canada. So they will be opportunistic about all of this. They'll be watching very carefully the military dimensions of the conflict and trying to figure out if that applies to potential invasion of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Looking specific. See, this is interesting too. We should just note, for example, remember the balloon affair a couple of weeks ago?
Yep.
So look how everybody in the media got focused on the specifics of shooting the balloon down, right? And everybody was oh my God, it's a violation of airspace, and what is it doing? All that minutia. What they're really doing, in addition to all those activities, is monitoring how we responded to it. We being the Canadian public, the American public, Canadian political and military leadership, American political and military leadership, and then how Canada and the U.S. cooperates or doesn't cooperate. So these things are being measured to try and figure out where weak points are, where they can leverage even more influence activities here in the future. So I think we're like guinea pigs to them. Frankly.
It's an experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, and the balloon thing is what the public sees. There's all sorts of other things the public does not see, specifically in the Arctic. So,
what role do you see them playing with respect to Ukraine and Russia, if any?
Good question. There's some people who have this aspirational idea that Z will stab Putin in the back and invade Siberia. I don't buy into that. I think the relationship's too tight. But what I do notice is with the withdrawal from START, that allows the Russians to build or deploy more weapons, which they're going to need for target coverage against China. So they're obviously a little concerned about what's going on with China. In terms of the specifics of support, I don't have any information on that. But with China, it's going to be anything they can do to gain an advantage elsewhere on the planet.
Yeah.
But they're going to be watching the Americans, NATO, the rest of us, in terms of how we militarily posture to signal and deter, and how effective that is. And they're going to try and figure out how that fits in their calculus of going after Taiwan or whatever other expansionist activities they've got in Africa or in the Pacific.
Now, you mentioned nuclear weapons, and that's something that you spend a lot of time looking at.
Yep.
Do you ever see Putin using them in this current conflict?
Oh, God.
Ukraine?
Yeah, they've been using them going right. They started flourishing this stuff around 2007, 9. They did a whole series of activities during the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. I'm writing a book on this now, and they did more maneuvering and signaling using strategic nuclear forces in the month of January 2022 than in the previous 5 years. And it's significant. They want us to see it. They want us to transmit it through our media to the populations to generate fear and intimidation. And so, at the same time, they wanted to see how Britain, U.S., and France and their nuclear forces react to it, how NATO reacts to it. So it has an intimidation function. It backstops their diplomacy. It also has a domestic function. We've deterred them, so we can do whatever we want within limits. But there's a lot of it. Like I watch it every day, and they're maneuvering mobile ballistic missiles. They're moving submarines around. They're definitely signaling with bombers up in the Arctic and elsewhere, and with their naval forces. So we see this all the time now, and it's on scales beyond the Cold War in some cases, from what I've seen. And the interesting thing is that they want us to know it, and they will transmit this so we can assess it.
Now, they're using them as a deterrent, but do you ever see them actually using them?
In terms of the weapons themselves?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's pretty clear. I went through all of their declaratory policy for 20 years. And it's all just different methods of justifying using it when they feel like they need to use it. But they've been deterred. I mean, they're in various senses. I'm sure that at one point last year, they thought about detonating weapon as a signal to collapse resolve in the West, and they backed away from that. I've got one. That's one I'm working on now.
Yeah.
The whole discussion of battlefield nuclear weapons use in Ukraine itself is very interesting, because I saw indications that they wanted us to think that they might use several of them because they were starting to lose, and then all of a sudden they backed off. And chem as well. They played the chem card a few times as well. So It's
What's
pretty
chemical you're talking?
yeah,
Is that what you're
chemical.
saying? Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So they've monkeyed around with signaling on those fronts, and the response in the West has been robust and open in many cases. So yeah, it's pretty clear to me he's been deterred on numerous occasions last year from doing something ridiculous, such as using nuclear weapons inside Ukraine itself.
So, from the general public's perspective, I know you study this every day, but from the general public's perspective, when you say that the West are making some changes to deter him from using anything, what is the West actually doing? What would they be doing to deter him,
Well,
nuclear-wise?
I'll give you a specific example. So, and this is where it gets technical as hell, right?
Yeah.
So, ballistic missile submarines. If everybody's seen Hunt for October, they know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, ballistic missile submarines are a deterrent. They go and hide in the ocean. They're there to be a wild card in case to convince the other side that if they do anything, there's an invulnerable system that will take them out too, right?
Yeah.
That's the general idea behind it. And so in the Cold War, you never knew where these things were. Nobody announced where they were. They're in the middle of the ocean somewhere. They take great means not to be tracked by the other side, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So during this crisis, on 2 occasions, the Americans have revealed the location of a ballistic missile submarine that was in an optimal firing point to basically flood the Russian nuclear systems with ballistic missiles from submarines.
Yeah.
They did that twice, and you could see how the other side reacted to that. They immediately became conciliatory and got on the hotline and started talking.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, they started doing that to us back in March 2021. They put 3 of those submarines through the Arctic ice on an exercise. They filmed it, and then they spread it all over social media. So when I looked at that, that was rather alarming because those 3 submarines had about 400 nuclear weapons aboard total. And they put them under the ice so you can't get at them except with another nuclear submarine, which Canada doesn't have, because we chose not to get them. So the Brits and the Americans have to hunt them up there. But their argument, they're making the point that they've got an invulnerable system that could pop up through the ice in minutes and flood us with them. So that was that was back in 2021. It was a very, very intimidating signal. Very intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of other things, but that one comes to mind particularly.
Let's move on to another topic, and that's if Putin loses this incursion into the Ukraine, what happens to him? Do you have a sense? Based upon history in the Soviet Union or in Russia?
Well, it's clear to a bunch of us that he was able to suppress the beginnings of some kind of coup last year, probably in March, April, May, somewhere in there. And those people were disappeared, or they fell out of windows, or were poisoned, or whatever.
Yeah.
So, or arrested and put on ice somewhere else. So that was and then of course on top of that, you have a whole series of oligarch deaths over the past year. So they're using murder to intimidate anybody who might possibly do anything. There.
For those who may not be aware, oligarchs are the rich billionaire Russians who made a lot of money in the last, 20 years?
Go right back to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
okay.
So there's specific, pretty barbaric intimidation. At one point, somebody offed an oligarch with his entire family in Spain very brutally. Okay. So there's a lot of people explain all these things away, but when you look at the pattern of it, it's pretty significant. And so the word is out, like, don't try anything. So you do see a couple characters who are vehemently critical of what goes on inside Ukraine. They're probably being allowed to do that. And so people have latched onto them and said, oh, these guys are the possible future coup d'etat against the Putin regime. But we know from history, with the Soviet Union, they ran an operation called the Trust, where they created an anti-Soviet organization run by the Cheka, which everybody was attracted to, and then they arrested everybody and killed them. I mean, they know how to play that game. Mm-hmm. So, in my view, I believe the regime is secure for now. That doesn't rule out a random event. Somebody takes a pistol and shoots him in the back of the head. Something like that. Doesn't rule that out.
Yeah.
But if he goes, there are other people that will step in. It's just a question of what's their belief system vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis what we're doing, whether they could, in their own political environment, pull troops out of Ukraine and survive. So, their best move right now is what they're doing, which is trying to freeze the conflict in place and then try to negotiate so they can hold on to what they got, which is exactly what they did in 2014.
Yeah.
And therefore, it can't be allowed because it'll just be the staging ground for the next phase 5 years from now, right?
There's a guy who gets a lot of coverage these days, and he is the head of a group called the Wagner Group, and his name, I think, is Prigozhin. And does he play a major role, or is he just someone out there on the fringes?
Oh, okay. This is really interesting because you go back and you look at his history. He doesn't just control Wagner. He also controls the Internet Research Agency, aka the Trolls from Olgino. And that's a GRU-supported, that's Russian military intelligence supported information warfare mechanism. Okay, so he's deeply involved in things just beyond Wagner. And my sense of it is whenever he shoots his mouth off, it's condoned. Because one thing we've seen in history with authoritarian leaders is to make sure that they don't get taken down, they'll pit their subordinates against each other and distract them. And that's what that smacks of to me. He takes runs at Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, and Valery Gerasimov, who's the chief of the general staff, or was. So it looks to me like that little circle of people bashing each other back and forth in social media, I think that's a distraction. I don't. If it's not condoned, then why is it happening? I guess is the argument there. And then there's guys like Patrushev, who's the spider at the center of the web up there, and he's gonna survive no matter what's going on. So we've been looking for a 1917 moment here. We're not seeing it.
Yeah. So the structure that was in place back in the 60s and 70s, where there was a Politburo that at least people in the West saw as a controlling group that sort of moved people up to the head of the line on a periodic basis. Does that exist anymore there in Russia?
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
No.
It's a one-man show.
Well, there's him and the Siloviki. So think of Putin at the center of a series of concentric circles, right? So he'll have, let's just call it an inner circle, then be an outer circle, etc. So he's insulated all the way around, and he can play all these people off against each other and survive. There's no Politburo type structure that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Let's look down the road a few years. What does Russia look like, say, in 10 years? Do you have a sense as to where that's going to go?
No. I mean, I'm an historian, and it's hard to predict. We look backwards. In this case, though, no, I can't predict that right now.
Yeah. Too many variables out there.
There's a lot of aspirational thinking out there in social media. It's fun to read. Like, what happens if Russia was broken up into various regions that weren't connected and all the nuclear weapons were taken away? I mean, that would be nice. We're not there.
Yeah.
So point here is, and this is important for Canadians, is that no matter what happens to Putin, we're in this for the long haul, just like we were in the Cold War. And arguably, things haven't changed that much in certain respects. We still need to be able to protect our airspace, be able to go after submarines, all the defensive stuff we need to do in North America. We're part of NATO, so we need to help deter any further incursion into Europe. Like, that hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And what, unfortunately, our means to do that has dropped off because people haven't been tracking what's been going on. A. B, they don't want to pay for it. And so everybody tends to rely on the U.S. and its nuclear deterrent to do everything. So, in my view, we need to step up our game because we're part of this. We're not neutral.
Yeah.
Part of NORAD, we're part of NATO. Our value system is completely dissimilar to communist China or Putin's Russia. No matter what critics want to say about how bad things are here, quote unquote, we're up against systems that will utterly influence and potentially destroy us if they have the opportunity to do so. And there are people that just don't want to believe that. And I can't convince people like that otherwise, so I don't bother trying. Again, there's a lot of Canadians think they're disconnected from this because it's over there. That's not a problem for us. But the problem was with the Beijing regime influence activities here they're starting to realize that it doesn't matter that they're over there, they're also here. And we're dealing with influence activities, and there's Russian influence activities, Beijing regime influence activities, Iran, others that play in our sandbox here. And people are generally unaware of it.
And the concern as well is if you look at the Arctic and things up north, there's not much up there to defend us if they decide to walk in.
Oh, well, this is part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
So we can't defend everywhere because then you defend nowhere. So where do you choose to do it? And airspace, obviously, underwater, obviously, the ability to project power onto certain things up there. But it's not just physical control. There can be corporate control. There are other forms of indirect influence that can be used to manipulate resources up there for somebody else, right? So there has to be diplomatic, legal, and economic coordination as well as military coordination, and it's all linked together. And that's something else that's hard to explain to people. You can't just do one thing; it has to be holistic. So that comes down to what are we about? What is our value system, and what are our interests? And that is under attack right now. Because when we're dealing with regionalism in Canada, that there's concern that can go the distance someday. So we wind up with a fragmented nation.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what are we? And when our own history is under attack about who we are, what we're about, and people don't, and they're being manipulated on the activist front, without actually doing proper historical research and really trying to understand what was going on, we've got real problems here, in my view.
Yeah.
So those are wedges that can be banged on by our opponents and are. So you see, for example, the Beijing regime will chide us on indigenous genocide. This is coming from a country that killed 44 million people in the 60s, 9 million in 1949-50. And yet Canadians take this to heart. That's absurd. They need to put it in perspective. I mean, and we're dealing with the history of the Soviet Union. It's the same problem. So we really didn't understand what was going on inside the Soviet Union until, well, past 20, 30 years of scholarship, right? So there's even more horrific stuff that went on inside the Soviet Union that we weren't even aware of. And it is not odd either. Like, it's like our country's stuck in the Second World War in terms of how it looks at the world, right?
Yeah.
In some ways.
I can see that. Yeah. Again, it's communication, is making sure Canadians have a better understanding of what's going on and then developing a plan to deal with it.
Well, yeah, I see media missteps on this all the time. Short attention span theater, lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
Let's put the bar low. Let's make it simple. And that's not useful, because when you're getting simplistic, you're vulnerable to the other side's simplistic information ops. We see that down in the States.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is to watch the conspiracism in the States and see how it's actually connected to conspiracism in the Soviet Union, and Russia in terms of themes.
Yeah.
And it all boils down to, there are these outside dark forces out there that you can't control, and you're subjected to, and you're helpless, right?
Yeah.
We're not helpless. We vote, we work, we spend money, we live.
Yeah.
Right?
Good. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts on this. Lots there to think about.
Yes.
I know that I've learned a lot just in this short period of time. That's for sure. Thank you.
Well, there's more. I mean, I wish there were more people discussing the details of some of this.
Yeah.
Because if we don't know what we're about and what we want, and whether it's feasible in the international and global environment, then we're just going to be kicked around by everybody else who's smarter and more agile than we are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Regardless of political belief or ideology, whatever.
Yeah.
Those basic things I just said, that's where we're at now. We definitely need to move beyond the dialogue or lack thereof that we've got right now and figure this out, or we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah. All right, Sean, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
No problem. Anytime.
Okay. My guest in this episode, Dr. Sean Maloney, professor in the History Department at the Royal Military College of Canada here in Kingston. For more information, check out his page on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.